good morning, bonjour. That's about how much French I speak. Although I am trying, I'm not confident enough to try it out on stage yet. Maybe after more tea. All right. As I said, this light is very bright. As I said, good morning. I'm Derick. I'm European, currently living in London. I do work for the PHP Foundation. I, at the moment, mostly do the system administration side of things. I wrote Xdebug, PHP's daytime support. You might have heard of that. I like maps, whiskey, and beer. Not relevant for this talk, but I thought I'd throw that out. And if you have any questions, you can find me on Mastodon, where you will mostly see me posting photos. All right, so let's dive straight in. There will be code on the slides. Now, PHP over the last years have added quite a bit of syntax, and it is not always obvious how these things all tie together. So what I usually try to do is show the progression about certain features. Now, but not all the time. So PHP 8.5 adds this new feature, which is called closures in constant expressions. They are a way of defining, like in this case, a default value for the callbacks, and they're all closures. They must be static functions or normal functions. They may not include all the variables because they need to be static. They need to be standing on their own. They can't have all the scope that are bound to. Now, this is terrible to read as code, isn't it? Nobody likes doing this. It's like writing a function that has a few callbacks that do the default thing. You loop over all of them, and then you return input. Or output, actually, but it's called input. Terrible to write. Now, PHP 8.5 first makes one simple modification to make it a lot more easier to read, because if it's just a function, you can use the short closure style. Great feature, right? Again, still not readable. So on top of this, we also have now the new pipe operator, as said that, which makes it look like this. So you have the input that you show. Basically, the pipe operator is like put the thing on the left-hand side to the function on the right-hand side. Only one argument, so you can only pass one variable on. Because you can only pass one variable along, at the moment you still have to wrap these closures for the second, third, and fourth option. And basically what this code does, it gets the input, sends it to str to lower, which then lowercases it. The output of that is also a string, which gets fed as a pipe to the closure. And it then does the preg replace, which you normally expect on this x variable, and the x variable is the one that you put into the closure. Now, you might see something that you might find slightly annoying, is that each of these clauses still have the parentheses around it. We originally did not have that, but that caused problems in the PHP engine because of the operator precedence. It basically would create like three levels deep nested closures, which was a pain in stack traces, hard to debug, or almost not possible to debug and things like that. So this pipe operator, which you can sort of see what a further progression of this could be, right? At the moment, we only have this closure here, so this callable function there, or the str to lower. It would also be really nice if we didn't have to wrap the rest of these things in this closure style with fn and stuff like that. So that is something that we're looking at for not PHP 8.5, but PHP 8.6 probably. So stay tuned here. Now, how would you debug this? Obviously, because there is, the standard way of doing this, what you normally would do if you have like chain methods, you'd have to assign it to a variable, see what's in the variable, and then call the next function and so on and so on, right? Which is not a nice way of doing it. But it was necessary for these pipes because there's no variable, no actual variable in between them. So we worked a little bit on making this also possible to do. I'm going to attempt a live demo. Yeah. All right. So I have it's a bit smaller here. So I have the same code here. I'm making sure it's in listening mode. Yeah, I did that. So yeah, this is the code. I will set a breakpoint on the first line. Come on. There you go. No. It doesn't like me to set a big breakpoint. I'll try that again. I don't know why that is. Okay, now let's try that out. Oh, not that one, that one. And if I reload this, if that should stop here. So it stops here at this line. I mean, this is normal debugging. This is nothing outstanding. But if I now do step in, it stops here at input hello world. Nothing new. But if I step over it, what do you think happens then? It doesn't step up, but it just stops at the next function call. And we still have the input, right? Because nothing has been executed. We do this once more. And then it will tell you here that there's an immediate value. So that is a value that is being passed from pipe to pipe to pipe. Now, I don't know how PHP Storm shows this yet, because I haven't tried it. But yeah, and you can then go through every step and step into the closure like you saw. My only demo. There you go. Nope. Now let's move on to some other things. PHP 8.4 adds this asymmetric visibility. It's a very hard word to say. Where before this feature existed, if you had like a private property, my tracks property in this case, this is something to do with parsing map stuff. So, in order to have something that is public read but private write, you'd had to create this wrapper function, right? That you have that private property and then a public getter, the get track functions. Now 8.4 added the following thing to that. So it added a keyword for that, so you can have public private set, which means that you can now from any scope read the tracks property, but you can only write to it from within the allowed scope. So in this case, only from objects of the class reader. So that we added that. 8.4 also had a simpler version of this. If it's just public read, then you don't have to specify that. There's some things around it. This only works on type properties, which shouldn't really be a problem. The set visibility must be equal or less than the main. Get visibility, these things all make sense. You don't really have to spell them out because they do pretty much what you would expect them to do. You can read the slide later. But in PHP 8.4, we still missed one thing here. So we have this public-private set for statics, which is something that wasn't allowed yet. Why not? We forgot about it. It's probably the correct way of doing that. So you can now do that as well. So you can have these static properties that have the dual visibility. In PHP 8.0, we introduced something as well. We introduced the how does it call it again? The constructor property promotion is probably the word to use, where if you just spell the visibility, the type, in the constructor definition, you didn't have to create the properties yourself, and you didn't have to do the assignment in the constructor either. Fine. But again, 8.4 introduced like property hooks, also fun, but this feature also introduced final properties. This was a thing that you could do, so inheriting classes couldn't override this, because overriding it would mean that you also override the logic to set that be called when you do get and set on this. And that then, of course, means, because we now have final properties, they also need to be allowed in constructor property promotion. So you can now do that here as well. I had to remove the private keyword from there, otherwise the code wouldn't work, obviously, but yeah, this is now another tiny keyword. These things are like little tiny syntax additions that are not very sexy to talk about, I would say, but they do make something so much easier. And especially with property hooks and the asymmetric visibility, you can get rid of so much boilerplate code that you otherwise had to write. Okay, on to the next one, the clone width feature. If you had a value object that basically these are a bucket of properties attached to an object, right? So in this case, I have a response class or a response object. We've defined them as final and read-only because they need to be unbreakable buckets of data. But sometimes you want to use that data that you have and create a new object out of that with some of these properties modified. And before PHP 8.5, you could do that by creating a wither method. A wither method basically means it's with plus what you're changing to it. And that's what I have in the function here. So you give it a code and then a reason phrase. And the way how you would create a new object is like you need to get all the current properties. You then set the values to the new ones that you're passing in this wither method, and then you do new self with all these values. And the ... values accepts an associative array, right? Where the key is the name of the property and the value is then becoming the value of the property. But this only works if you can set all the properties through the constructor, because otherwise there's no way for you to set them. This is working, but it isn't a great solution of doing it. So in PHP 8.5, we add something new here. So we still have this with status method, so we're not changing that. But instead of doing this trick by getting all the object variables, setting the new ones, and then creating a new object, you can do this now with the clone keyword. Now the clone keyword is not just the clone keyword anymore, it is now an actual function, which as first argument gets the object to clone, and then the second argument is then the array of properties that you want to change, which is a much cleaner way and much less code to write way of doing that. And it also works for properties that you couldn't set through the constructor as well. Now with this, because these properties are going to be set when you call this method, when clone is called, all the visibility checks still work for them. It will still respect where the private set and things like that. Property hooks are still called. If you have a set method, or so I should say an underscore set method, these will all be checked. The type needs to be correct and stuff like that as well. The only thing that is basically being disabled when you do this is the read-only keyword during the time the clone runs. And then at the end of the method, the read-only is then applied again, so you get this new object that again is final and read-only. We originally wanted a different syntax for this, right, like weird parentheses and curly braces, but it didn't make a whole lot of sense to do. But it was necessary if clone was only a keyword. Because it's now also a function, we have the second way of doing it. You can still use clone, space, and then the object name, the object variable. But if you want to use the second argument, then you need to use the function way of doing it. Right. So anybody uses parse URL? Yeah, so I always like to have one poop emoji in my slides. The reason why I'm actually saying this, and I'm not being facetious, no, that doesn't work, is that the parse URL function parses a URL according to unspecified rules. Like the way how it handles encoding of things in which place, it does do some specific PHP-related things that might have made sense when it was introduced, but it doesn't follow any standard, which makes it really hard to use in a safe, sometimes, way, or in a way where you need to be interoperable with other systems. So PHP 8.5 introduces a new URL object and class. It's called URI what.wg URL : parse, which is something you end up having to use when you embed URLs in HTML. So anything you need to update, like a fragment, or how do you call that, when you need to create a link to a different page and stuff like that. This one is the best one. But of course, we can't only just have one, because that'd be too easy. There's also a second one, which has an even more easy to remember name, which is URI RFC 3986/URL parse, which does the same thing, but with slightly different parsing rules. And this one is more focused on server-to-server communication. Why exactly? If you want to know that, please read the RFC. It's only 40 pages long. I have not read it. So, now, what would you do with this thing? You would do the following things. Parse URL, if I remember correctly, actually gives you an associative array back with all the options. These objects don't do that. They will give you methods to attach all these things. And beyond get scheme and get host, there's also, for some cases, there's get role path. Because The wg one also automatically decodes like the percent double hex digit kind of syntax for you, if you want to do that. And the way how it does that depends on where in the URL this occurs, because the domain name, the paths, the query arguments, there's all different rules of what you can use and what needs to be encoded. And this class will handle that all for you without having to deal with that, which I think is quite nice. But good luck trying to remember this .wg long name. Of course, the example that I have doesn't use that. It uses the RFC 39861, but it works in a similar way. The interesting thing is that not only can you do getters, there's also setters for all of these paths. So if you need to update something, you can do that and then ask for the full URL back, and it knows exactly which bits to encode for you and not. So that makes it a lot easier than having to remember whether you need to do any kind of raw encoding in these URLs for yourself. So I think it's a nice addition. And then, yeah, you get some example out of it. Now, the next thing to have a look at is OPcache. So OPcache is an extension that was always delivered with PHP, but it wasn't always loaded for you. So if you wanted, OPcache is something that pretty much everybody should use in a production environment, because the only thing it does is makes things go faster, and that is always a good thing. But there's always situations where that isn't what you want. OPcache does try to do clever things sometimes. So having OPcache optimizations with a debugger makes no sense. So Xdebug turns these things off, even if you have it loaded. But OPcache is this shared extension that gets delivered separately, and you needed to enable that by using Zend_extension equals OPcache in a ini file somewhere. Now, from PHP 8.5, that is no longer a thing. OPcache is now a built-in extension, like the standard extension, or the array extension, or the datetime extension. However, it is not turned on by default for similar reasons, like it might sometimes change the output slightly, or what the program does slightly. But the introduction of OPcache into the PHP engine now makes it possible to be much more clever what kind of optimizations the engine can do. OPcache itself always had this optimizer in that, which was a bit old because it sort of was part of PHP, but also sort of not. And due to this barrier, it being a loaded extension, is actually really hard to improve certain optimizations. These haven't been made yet, but that is something that we'll likely be looking at in further PHP versions. 8.6 or 9 or whatever we come up with as our next number. I said that. All right. So I think that is a nice addition. Hopefully that makes it more likely that all of you will start using OPcache in production environments as well to make things go faster. Now, in PHP 8.0, we introduce attributes. Attributes are these hash and then the square bracket syntax, things that you can attach to functions, classes, class constants, class properties, class methods, and function method parameters. Lots of things. Can you see anything missing here? Well, we were not allowing it for constants. Class constants were fine, but normal constants were not. Why not? We probably forgot about it, which happens a lot. So now in PHP 8.5, you can have them on class constants. Sometimes. You can't do it if you define multiple constants in one statement, because it makes it hard to reason about where this attribute then belongs to. Does it only belong to the first one, or all of them? So we don't allow it. It also does not work if you define a global constant with define, because that is a function call. So you'd be setting my attribute on define, which makes no sense because it's an internal function that you haven't written yourself. So you can't do that either. Kind of useful, I suppose. I don't think I've used a global constant in a long, long time, though. Oh yes, of course, because we now also have a new target for the attributes, there's also this new extra enum class to go for attribute, the target constant one. Will I use this? Probably not. But these attributes are quite fun, so we decided to add a few more. So PHP 8.5 adds the no discard attributes. That is one that basically tells the runtime engine that if a function returns a value, but that value isn't used in the function that calls this, then it will throw a warning. Where would this make sense? Well, a place where I've seen this, where this is a problem, is if you use datetime immutable, you call the method on it, and then you don't do anything with the return value, which basically means this is a useless function call or a method call because the result gets thrown away immediately. You often see this if people start converting datetime to datetime immutable and don't update the method calls everywhere to then make use of the new return value. This is an example that I've noticed, but this happens quite a bit. So if you do this now in PHP 8.5, you will get a warning shown for you, saying that you need to make the use of the return value. Now this is done, that is built in to the built-in class datetime immutable, but the no discard attribute is also something you can use yourself. So if you have an API where it is really important that the return value gets used, you really want to make sure that the consumers of an API check the error code, for example. Excuse me, then you can use this attribute to tell that to users of your API that you really need to be using the return value out of this object. Some caveats. If you, for example, just want to ignore it for sure and you know what you're doing, you can use this void cast. Basically, you cast the result that gets returned to the void. I don't think you should be doing that, but there might be a good use case for this. You also can't use discard on methods that don't return anything to begin with. So if you tag something, if you return type something to void or never, then there is no return value, so you can't use the discard attribute on that, and you get an error for that. Same thing like for magic methods or the constructor, it also doesn't work there, because it makes no sense. Why would you want to enforce not discarding the return value of new? Makes no sense. Then we get a little bit more into attributes that we already had. So we have had this deprecated trait attribute. So you could add deprecated, you could tag that to a function or a method or a bunch of other things. But you couldn't add it to a trait yet. So PHP 8.5 introduced deprecated on a trait class as well. Just a question from my side. Raise your hand if you use traits. More than I thought. Yeah. Okay, that's some useful information for me here. I haven't, but I'm always interested in seeing what you're using. Not the most interesting thing in the world either, but it's kind of handy. Now, something that is actually quite handy is the following. Now, if in PHP 8.4 you run the following code, right? I have my index.php file, I call it code.php on the bottom, require autoload. I know that should usually be vendor autoload, but this is an example. I do new my datetime class. SPL autoload loads the class from class my datetime class, implements datetime interface. In PHP 8.4, you'll get an error like this, right? Datetime interface can't be implemented by user classes. You might have seen this at some point. Now, 8.5 actually adds stack traces to this. So you get a stack trace where these happen. But only if it's a fatal error do you get a stack trace. Because creating stack traces takes time to do. So PHP doesn't want to do that for every warning or notice that you might get, because it just takes time. Obviously, if any of you have used Xdebug in the last 25 years, then you'd already have gotten this stack trace, which actually includes a little bit more information. It includes information about the variable names and what the variables for include are, for example. Now, that of course also means, because I just said it takes time to make these, that this is one of the reasons why Xdebug makes things run a little bit slower. But at least you don't have to wait until PHP 8.5 to see your stack traces. This is not a talk about Xdebug, though. Right, next interesting thing is, does any of you use the filter extension? Okay, that's pretty good. Who is a fan of the API of the filter extension? No hands now. I actually sort of agree. There is some weird things in here. Like if you use filter var on a variable and you validate it, it returns false if it couldn't validate it, but false could also be a correct answer for some of these validations. So that's really quite weird. And if that was a situation for a specific bit of code, what you could do to filter far, you could add this filter null on failure, and then instead of it returning false, it returns null, which should have been the default, in my opinion. And I did fight for that when we introduced this in PHP 4.4. I know, I'm dating myself here. But still, this is not a great way of doing it, right? Now, what would be the obvious way of doing this? If a filter validation fails, what would you do now? If you create this API, you throw an exception, right? That's what you would do. So PHP 8.5 now introduces filter throw on failure flag, which then means that if the validation fails, it will throw an exception of the class filter/filter exception, and then you can handle that yourself. At some point, would I like to see this to be the default? Yes. It was never the default before because exceptions thrown by internals wasn't a thing in PHP 4. It just wasn't a thing. Nothing even was an object back then, or a class, I should say. So I think this is a nice addition, and I believe this. If we now would design this API, we'd do it this way, but we can't do that. We can't change people's code in the past. All right. In PHP 7.3, yes, I'm now going back almost 8 years, we introduced this array key first function that basically gives you the first key in an array that's returned. So in this case, if you do find all the time zone transitions for keys, the first key is going to be 0 and the last one is 122, just a thing. But if you then want to access the values of the first and the last one, you have to do something weird like this. So you have to do var dump of the transitions array, and then you have to, in the square brackets, array key first, transitions array. So you end up using this. I mean, this looks ugly, right? Now, the fun thing is, when we started introducing array key first in 7.3, there was also a proposal to also have a function for returning the first value or the last value in an array. But that got voted down. I can't remember why that was, because this is 8 years ago. But in PHP 8.5, we now have these functions. So they're called array first and array last, making that a lot easier, which I think is a nice, again, but simple addition to PHP. All right, now we're going to have some fun with languages. First, some 8.4 stuff. We have this emoji. We want basically each character in a string to be shown separately. Anybody wants to guess what comes out of this? No? I will show you. It shows you this. Because PHP standard string functions, they operate on bytes. So that's what you get out. Now, you all know how to fix this, right? How would you improve on this? You use MB string split, right? Let's try. So what does this output? Anybody wants to guess? Does it output a single character emoji? No, it doesn't. It actually returns 4 characters. It's the base emoji, the shrugging person. There's a character that says, combine this with other stuff. The first thing that we're adding is the male variant of this emoji instead of the neuter one. And then the last one, well, it has no representation. Basically is a variation selector. You can use these for changing the skin tones in emojis and stuff like that. So a single emoji still shows up as 4 characters, which is not what you want if you do if you want to do a word wrap, for example, right? Now, PHP 8.5 introduces a new function for this called the grapheme string split, which is part of the Intel extension in PHP, which knows how to do Unicode properly. Anybody wants to guess what comes out of this? This single character emoji, yes. Finally, we are there. Now, this is PHP 8.4. And the same thing works fine if you have flags in it, for example. You get hello with all the... See, my browser doesn't actually know how to render the character properly. But, hey, what can I do? Now, 8.5 adds a few things in there. So you have the Levenstein method. It's an algorithm for figuring out how much words differ from each other. So my name is Derick. It is not Derick with 2 R's or Derick. I see so many variations of my spelling. And with Levenstein, you can basically create like a fingerprint of how far these are from each other, right? So for every letter that is different, it counts 1. For every deletion, it is 1. And for every insertion, it's 1. And you can change these weights by arguments to the Levenstein function. But if we do this for, say, for example, flags, then what do you think the output of this ought to be? It's a 1 character thing that is different, right? But when you output this, you get 2 or 20 in this case out of it, because there's 2 things different. Which 2 things are different in these flags? Well, if you look at how these are built, they're basically, the flags are built up of each character of the country code attached together, and that then makes a flag. So the first one would be UA, and the second one would be PS, and because these are each different, you get 2 differences out of this. We don't want that. So 8.5 introduces grapheme Levenstein, which does the same thing but then correct, and then obviously you get 1 out of that because only 1 logical character has changed. So this gets more complicated if you also have to deal with different languages. This is Welsh for I'd like some water, please. That's fine, I have some water. But Levenstein normally would only look at the characters themselves. It wouldn't know about lowercase and uppercase. But sometimes you might actually want to do that. And this grapheme Levenstein function now has an extra method to it where you can define the locale, and that looks like gibberish if you don't know what you're looking at. You probably have seen the language underscore region bit of it, right? Like in this case, CY is Welsh in Great Britain. Then you have this flag separated EU, and then the Unicode standard allows you to do lots of different flags attached to that. So the one that I'm done here is I've done the strength, and the strength basically means which characters should be considered the same. So with strength 2, for example, uppercase and lowercase variants of the letter is the same. If you do strength 1, then letters with accents are also considered the same variant and stuff like that. So for Levenstein, which probably not many of you use, at least I never used it in anger, this is not so useful, but it is also something that we added to all the other grapheme functions. So if you want to do a string position, which sometimes depends on the locale, like if you have a Turkish I, right? Turkish has 2 I's, one with a dot and one without a dot, and an uppercase version of both of those, which English doesn't have. So in these cases, adding these levels is actually really useful to do. I know Autobahnstraße makes no sense as a word, but it shows you what it does. Like if you don't specify the locale, then it doesn't find the SS, but if you specify the German locale, then it does do that because the beta character in Autobahnstraße is the same letter as SS. All right, a little bit about new policies. If we want to introduce a new feature in PHP, not only can you say yes and no, you can also say abstain. That basically means now it's okay to not have an opinion, but still registered. Is this useful? Probably. One thing I did, however, is that our voting form, it was then too wide on a mobile device, so we had to redesign how this looked like as well. Pain. All right, we also have another policy API, which is adopting Pi, which is a modern installer for PHP extension. I'm not going to have time to talk about that, but there will be a talk about it tomorrow at 11-ish, done by James, talk about Pi, which is hopefully going to be a replacement for Packle pretty soon. All right, I said that, yes. I have a few moments for any questions, if you have any. Anything PHP related is fine. I think if you ask them in French, then somebody can translate for me. Norwegian, Dutch, or German is fine, and English. Thanks.
Thank you, Derick. We have time for one question.
Yeah? There's none at the moment. Oh, there's one there on the right-hand side. So it's hard to see all. Yeah, no, I should have brought my hat.
Okay, thank you very much for this talk. Very interesting. I was curious maybe about the function array first, array last.
Yeah.
Before this, I was using, for example, reset and end functions as a workaround because it modifies the internal pointer of the array.
Yeah.
So I was curious about this internal pointer. Is it something that you think will last in the future versions, or is it something that may disappear?
I can't think of why we would want to remove this internal pointer structure. Mostly because this is basically how every internal function of PHP also loops through an array. So it makes no sense to remove that whatsoever. So no, I'm pretty sure that will stay. Yeah, because it is useful regardless of whether you use array first or last. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question? We have time.
Okay. Yeah, we have...
on the left.
Yeah, right there in front of me. Oh, there too. Hiya.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question about the string manipulation function. So
yeah.
There is now another way to do the same thing than before that didn't work before. Is there a plan to deprecate those?
Well, I don't think there's a plan to deprecate the PHP string split. The MB string split is, so MB string is a useful extension, but not so much anymore, in my opinion. All the things that the MB string extension does, the Intel extension through the grapheme function does better and operates correctly on Unicode characters, these combined characters. Will we get rid of MB string? I think that is going to be a very tough thing to do because people have been using this so much over the last 25 years when the grapheme functions didn't work or didn't exist. So I would like it, but I don't think it will happen anytime soon. Yeah, but yeah, it is a bit weird to now have three things for the same, or three functions do the same thing, but one of them is correct. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, the last one.
There was one right here.
On the front, yes.
Thank you for this great presentation, and thank you for your video on YouTube. I love them.
Thanks.
And what are the next project milestone you are excited about for the future of PHP?
That's always a tricky one. I think we are doing some good research into asynchronous processing in PHP at the moment. There is an enormous RFC that I haven't time to read through yet. If that is done in a sensible way, I think that could be really useful. We are continue to look at generics. Will that ever happen in PHP? I can't see it happening at the moment because it's such a complicated thing. Beyond that, I don't really know actually. It's hard to predict what shows up in the internet, what would be useful to have as a feature to a language, right? Like the JSON extension was never planned to be in there, but everybody started using JSON, so PHP needed to use JSON as well. I'm sure some people are looking at doing machine learning things with PHP, but that isn't something that I find very interesting, so I can't get excited about that. All right.
Thank you so much, Derick.
You're welcome.